What if I told you that one of the most powerful weapons of World War II wasn't a tank, or a bomb, or even a soldier with a gun, but an inflatable army, a fake general, and a handful of artists armed with rubber, paint, and sound effects? This is the true story of the Ghost Army, a top-secret Allied unit tasked with fooling Hitler himself. Using deception, disguise, and pure imagination, they staged one of the greatest military hoaxes in history, and changed the course of the war without ever firing a shot. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Belgium, and all the way to the heart of Germany, this elite group of creators became masters of illusion, and their mission remained classified for over 50 years. So sit back, relax, and get ready to uncover the invisible battle behind the victory. This is Operation Fortitude, the Ghost Army that fooled Hitler. In the summer of 1943, as Allied forces pushed closer to victory in World War II, one thing was certain: retaking Europe would come at a terrible cost. Hitler's forces still controlled much of the continent, and if the Allies were going to launch an invasion, they had to get it exactly right, or face annihilation on the beaches. But how do you deceive an enemy with thousands of spies, a vast intelligence network, and complete control over the western coast of Europe? The answer: illusion, trickery, and a bold idea so audacious it sounded like something out of a magician's notebook. This was the beginning of Operation Fortitude, the greatest deception campaign in modern military history, and the story of the mysterious Ghost Army that helped make it happen. At the heart of Fortitude was a simple but dangerous goal: make Hitler believe the Allied invasion would land anywhere but Normandy. If the Germans could be convinced to move their forces elsewhere, and leave the Normandy beaches lightly defended, the real invasion, known as Operation Overlord, could succeed. This wasn't a job for soldiers alone. This mission called for artists, actors, engineers, and illusionists, people who understood how to craft a false reality. The U.S. military formed a top-secret unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later known as the Ghost Army. Their assignment? Convince the Nazis that a massive Allied invasion force was gathering in southeast England, preparing to land at Pas-de-Calais, the closest point between Britain and France. From the moment they formed, the Ghost Army was wrapped in secrecy. Many of its members didn't even know the full scope of what they were doing. Officially, they were a special engineering unit. In reality, they were about to become one of the most creative and unconventional forces ever assembled. Unlike other military units, the Ghost Army wasn't built around firepower. It was built around deception. They would use inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, fake radio transmissions, and even sound effects to create the illusion of entire divisions. When they moved into a location, it would appear as though 30,000 troops had arrived, even if there were only 100 men. But the Ghost Army wasn't working alone. Operation Fortitude was a multi-layered deception campaign, involving double agents, fake documents, planted rumors, and elaborate misdirection. The operation was split into two parts: Fortitude North, which aimed to suggest an Allied invasion of Norway, and Fortitude South, which targeted Pas-de-Calais, Hitler's most likely expectation. To sell the lie, the Allies built an entirely fake army, the first U.S. Army Group, Fusag, supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, one of the most feared and aggressive generals in the Allied ranks. German intelligence believed Patton would lead the invasion, and the Allies did everything to reinforce that belief. They set up fake encampments visible from the sky. Inflatable tanks were carefully positioned and moved regularly to simulate activity. Trucks drove in loops to kick up dust. Soldiers made noise at night and used pre-recorded audio of troop movements and construction. Radio operators created fake traffic between units that didn't exist. And every step of the way, the Ghost Army was watching their false world come alive. What made this work wasn't just the props, it was the performance. Soldiers posed as officers in cafes, spreading rumors. By accident. Fake news reports were planted in neutral countries. Letters were forged. Maps were faked. Even body language and clothing were scripted. To fool the enemy, every detail had to be perfect. And it worked. The Germans, flooded with contradictory reports and fake intelligence, became obsessed with Pas-de-Calais. Even after the real D-Day landings began in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler refused to move his forces. He believed it was all a trick, and the real invasion was still coming at Calais. Thanks to the Ghost Army and Operation Fortitude, that belief lasted just long enough to change the course of the war. Before the Ghost Army could trick Hitler, it had to become real, not in strength, but in presence. And that presence had to be powerful enough to fool the most experienced military minds in the world. The year was 1944. In southeastern England, near the coastal towns of Dover and Folkestone, the Allied forces began assembling what appeared to be a massive army: tanks, trucks, supply lines, and tents stretching for miles. But anyone who looked closely, and not many ever did, would see the truth. The tanks were made of inflated rubber, lightweight enough for 2 soldiers to carry. The artillery pieces were canvas shells stretched over wooden frames. Even the airplanes parked on makeshift runways were dummies, designed to be seen from a distance, or photographed by German reconnaissance planes flying overhead. This was the work of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, an elite unit of fewer than 1,100 men tasked with impersonating more than 30,000. And they were good at it. This wasn't just camouflage. It was full-on theatrical illusion, built with military precision and artistic genius. The Ghost Army was made up of a strange mix of talents. There were sound engineers from Hollywood, set designers from Broadway, painters from New York and Chicago, and radio technicians trained to mimic entire divisions. Some of them were students from art schools. Others had worked in advertising or architecture before the war. Now, they were soldiers of deception. They called their 3 core strategies: visual, sonic, and radio deception. Each one played a different role in completing the illusion. First came the visuals. Inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery were set up in convincing formations. Camouflage netting covered them, but not too much, just enough to make them seem real while remaining visible to enemy spies and aerial photos. They were constantly moved and rearranged, so it looked like troop movements were happening. Laundry lines were hung between tents. Mess halls were faked. Latrines were dug. Even tire tracks were carefully pressed into the dirt to look like heavy vehicles had passed through. Then came sound deception, handled by a team of engineers from the 3132nd Signal Service Company. Using massive speakers mounted on jeeps, they blasted pre-recorded sounds of tanks idling, troops marching, engineers hammering, and bulldozers scraping. These audio illusions were recorded in real army camps and could be customized for terrain, echoing through forests, or muffled across open fields. Played at just the right volume, these sounds could be heard up to 15 miles away. Lastly, radio deception completed the illusion. This was perhaps the most delicate and convincing part of the operation. Skilled radio operators mimicked the chatter of entire divisions. They followed strict protocols, call signs, slang, and even the unique pacing of each unit's communications. German intelligence had grown used to listening in on these frequencies. Now, they were hearing an entire army preparing for an invasion that didn't exist. It wasn't enough to fool a single scout or camera. The Ghost Army had to convince the entire German high command. And to do that, every layer of the illusion had to reinforce the others. They worked quickly and quietly, often arriving under cover of night, setting up their inflatable divisions before the sun rose, and vanishing just as fast days later, leaving behind nothing but trampled grass and faint tire tracks. They were ghosts by design. Seen, heard, believed, but never truly real. Their success depended not just on what they created, but who they portrayed. And for that, they needed a face, a name the Germans would never question. So they turned to the most feared general in the Allied forces, General George S. Patton. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the Allies used one man's reputation, and one phantom army, to convince Hitler that Normandy was just a decoy. If deception had a face, it was George S. Patton. By early 1944, Patton was a legend, and a problem. Known for his aggressive leadership in North Africa and Sicily, He was both respected by his troops and feared by his enemies. He moved fast, talked loud, and didn't play by anyone's rules. Hitler believed Patton would lead the Allied invasion of Europe, and the Allies knew that. So they made it true, at least on paper. As part of Operation Fortitude South, the Allies created a fictional army group known as FUSAG, the first United States Army group, and placed it under Patton's command. It didn't matter that FUSAG didn't exist. It only mattered that the Germans thought it did. Posters, patches, documents, and orders were printed for this imaginary force. A headquarters was set up in Kent, southeast England, facing the narrowest part of the English Channel, the Pas-de-Calais. From a strategic standpoint, this location made perfect sense. It was the shortest crossing to France, had major rail lines nearby, and would allow rapid deployment if taken. But FUSAG was never meant to invade. Its job was to act as the threat, the looming fist the Germans couldn't ignore. And the Allies poured everything into selling the illusion. They sent Patton himself to tour the fake encampments. He reviewed inflatable tanks as if they were real, surrounded by photographers, foreign observers, and carefully placed accidental witnesses. Spies loyal to the Germans were fed the sightings. Enemy radio intercepts picked up fake messages suggesting that Patton was preparing for an assault. The legend grew. The British intelligence agency MI5 played a crucial role here. They controlled most of the German spies operating in the UK, having flipped or captured them earlier in the war. These double agents became perfect tools to feed Berlin misinformation, information they believed was credible because it came from their own sources. One of the most effective of these agents was Juan Pujol Garcia, known to the Germans as Agent Garbo. He created dozens of fictional sub-agents and sent daily reports, weaving an entire web of lies about Allied troop buildup in the southeast. He told Berlin that FUSAG was the real invasion force, and that the activity in Normandy was likely a diversion. His reward? The Germans awarded him the Iron Cross, completely unaware that he was feeding them lies written by the British. All the pieces of the puzzle were in place now, a fake army under a real general. Dummy tanks and ships lined along the southern coast. Ghost soldiers spreading rumors in cafes and pubs. Radio waves buzzing with invented orders and logistics. Double agents reinforcing the narrative at every turn. From the German perspective, everything matched up. All roads pointed to Calais. Even as Allied forces began quietly moving their real invasion force to the west, toward Normandy, the Germans remained fixated on the wrong target. To them, Patton was too dangerous, too bold, too obvious a choice to ignore. They had no idea that Patton himself was simply another weapon in the deception. As spring turned to summer, Hitler poured more men, tanks, and artillery into the Pas-de-Calais region. It was the wrong move, but one he believed was entirely right. And so, by the time dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Germans still had their backs turned. The Ghost Army had done its job, but the greatest test was still ahead. Would the illusion hold after the real invasion began? Dawn broke over the coast of Normandy with the roar of Allied landing craft cutting through the surf. Thousands of ships filled the channel. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Guns thundered. The largest seaborne invasion in history had begun. But not everyone believed it. In Berlin, the German High Command watched the reports come in, and hesitated. Could this really be the invasion? The location didn't make sense. Normandy lacked the large harbors needed to resupply an army. It was farther from London than Calais. And more importantly, where was General Patton? The deception had worked too well. Because Patton and the fake First United States Army Group remained in Kent, visible to German intelligence, and still preparing for an attack, Hitler and his top commanders became convinced Normandy was just a diversion. A feint. A trick to draw German troops away from the real landing at Pas-de-Calais. And so, while thousands of Allied troops stormed the beaches and faced heavy resistance, German reinforcements stayed put. Entire divisions, tanks, and artillery units remained in Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The Allies knew this moment was critical. If the Germans discovered the truth too soon, they could shift their forces and crush the beachheads before the Allies secured them. So Operation Fortitude didn't stop on D-Day, it intensified. The Ghost Army continued its act, reinforcing the illusion that Patton's massive army was still in place. New dummy equipment was inflated and moved around. Fake radio traffic increased, suggesting imminent landings at Calais. Double agents continued to feed insider updates to Berlin. Agent Garbeau reported that the Normandy landings were a decoy and insisted that Patton's army was still awaiting orders to cross at Calais. Other agents echoed the same narrative. The Germans bought it. Completely. Hitler himself ordered that no troops be transferred from Calais to Normandy. He believed the main assault would come at any moment, and that Normandy was a mere distraction. For nearly 7 crucial weeks, the German 15th Army, one of the most powerful formations in Western Europe, remained in place, guarding the wrong coast. Back in Normandy, the real Allied invasion hung by a thread. The fighting was brutal. Casualties were high. The terrain was difficult. German resistance was fierce, but not as fierce as it could have been. The success of the landings wasn't just due to bravery and planning. It was because the bulk of Hitler's war machine was looking the wrong way. Meanwhile, the Ghost Army maintained its eerie ballet. At night, they played the sounds of tanks and trucks moving through villages. During the day, they broadcast encrypted radio orders for fictional battalions. From the air, German reconnaissance planes saw exactly what they expected: large camps, armored units, and fuel depots near Dover. But it was all smoke and mirrors, sound and rubber. One of the Ghost Army's most daring tricks during this period was creating the illusion of an amphibious invasion fleet. Using inflatable landing craft, canvas ships, and clever lighting, they gave the impression of a massive force ready to cross the channel. German observers watched the fake fleet build day by day, bracing for an attack that never came. It was theater on a military scale, and the enemy was the audience. By the time Hitler realized he had been fooled, it was too late. The Allies had secured Normandy, built their supply lines, and begun the push inland. France was no longer under Nazi control, and the noose was tightening around the Reich. But the Ghost Army's mission wasn't over yet. The success in Normandy only proved how powerful deception could be. And as the Allies moved east toward Germany, the ghosts would be called on again. They weren't finished. They had more illusions to cast, and more enemies to confuse. The Normandy landings had succeeded. France was in motion. The Allies were advancing eastward, pushing German forces back town by town, field by field. But now came a new challenge: maintaining momentum across unpredictable terrain, and keeping the enemy guessing. While Operation Fortitude had fulfilled its grand purpose on the coast, the Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was about to enter an entirely different phase of deception. One that required them to take their illusions directly to the front lines. These weren't sprawling canvas encampments visible to spy planes anymore. Now, the deceptions had to happen quickly, quietly, and under pressure, often just a few miles from actual combat zones. The stakes were different too. Instead of tricking the German high command in Berlin, the Ghost Army now had to deceive field commanders on the move, with lives hanging in the balance. This next chapter of their mission began in earnest after the breakout from Normandy, and the rapid Allied thrust across France in the summer of 1944. As Allied divisions leapfrogged through territory, the Ghost Army was deployed to simulate the presence of whole units, covering gaps in the line, protecting flanks, or disguising strategic withdrawals. One of their most impressive tools at this stage was the use of spoof units, small, mobile deception teams that could roll into an empty village and, in the space of a few hours, create the illusion of a division-sized presence. They would set up inflatable Sherman tanks and artillery along roadsides and hedgerows, park dummy jeeps and supply trucks around farms and barns, lay out fake command tents, complete with laundry lines and soldiers' gear, light controlled campfires to mimic active encampments, use sound trucks to play loops of marching, digging, and tank movement, broadcast radio traffic specific to the unit they were impersonating, even plant fake road signs or division insignia, on nearby buildings. And perhaps most daringly, the Ghost Army began using special effects soldiers. These were men who, dressed in the uniforms of the unit being impersonated, wandered into local towns, chatted with curious civilians, and spread intentional rumors about upcoming operations. They were trained in slang, posture, and even officer behavior to convincingly play the role of men who weren't really there. Every detail mattered. A misplaced accent, an incorrect patch, or a vehicle facing the wrong direction could unravel the illusion. These operations were dangerous. The Ghost Army wasn't a combat unit. Most of its members carried only sidearms. They had no tanks of their own, no heavy weapons. And yet they were frequently deployed near the front, often without full protection, because their illusions had to be seen by the enemy to be believed. One of their most daring battlefield deceptions took place near Metz in eastern France, where the Ghost Army was tasked with simulating the presence of the 6th Armored Division to convince the Germans that a major thrust was coming from a different direction. In just 36 hours, they set up an entire fake armored column using inflatables, sound, and radio, while the real 6th Armored slipped away to attack elsewhere. The ruse worked. German forces stayed in position, defending an empty road. By late 1944, the Ghost Army had become more than just a curiosity. It was a weapon, one the Allies deployed strategically to manipulate the enemy's perception. They moved over 20 times across Europe, staging deceptions in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself. Their role was still top secret. Most Allied soldiers didn't even know they existed. And yet they stood between divisions, covered vulnerable flanks, and distracted enemy commanders from real movements, with no bullets fired. They weren't just winning battles. They were rewriting how war was fought. By early 1945, the Allied advance was unstoppable. Germany's borders had been breached. Cities like Aachen had fallen. The Nazi war machine was buckling under relentless pressure from both the West and the East. But one formidable natural obstacle still stood between the Allies and the German heartland, the Rhine River. This wide, fast-moving river was more than just a geographical barrier. It was Hitler's last defensive line. The Germans believed they could hold the Allies at bay along its banks, buying time to regroup, or even negotiate from a position of strength. But the Allies had no intention of waiting. And once again, deception would play a vital role in getting across. Enter the Ghost Army. The plan was ambitious. Allied forces wanted to cross the Rhine at several points. One real crossing would take place at Wesel, but in order to succeed, they needed to divert German attention elsewhere, and make the Wehrmacht believe the primary crossing would happen farther to the south. That became the Ghost Army's new target, a town called Bad Kreuznach. With fewer than 1,000 men, they were tasked with simulating the presence of 2 full divisions preparing to cross the Rhine. This operation, like so many before it, combined every tool of deception they had mastered over the previous year. They began by deploying inflatable tanks and trucks under camouflage netting near forested areas close to the river. The layout was meticulously planned to mirror how a real armored division would position itself before a major assault. From the air, and to German scouts, the scene looked convincing. Next came sonic deception. Sound teams used massive speakers hidden in tree lines to blast recordings of troop movement, engineers building pontoon bridges, and tank engines revving. The audio tracks had been carefully engineered and adapted to match the acoustics of the riverbank terrain. Played at the right time of day, the illusion of a massive force preparing for an assault was complete. Radio deception played a crucial supporting role. Skilled operators created fake traffic suggesting the presence of the 75th and 30th Infantry Divisions, complete with unit jargon, call signs, and encrypted coordination. German intercept teams picked it all up and passed the intelligence along. To reinforce the illusion on the ground, special operations soldiers, dressed in the proper insignia, moved through nearby towns, chatting in cafes, deliberately leaving forgotten maps behind, and leaking false orders to eavesdroppers. Within days, German commanders in the area were convinced a major river crossing was imminent near Bad Kreuznach. Reconnaissance confirmed what they thought they were hearing: tank build-up, bridge materials, and motor pools. The German 15th Army began shifting resources to the area, reinforcing their lines along that section of the Rhine. And that's when the real Allied crossing began, over 100 kilometers to the north, at Wesel. There, under cover of darkness and with far less resistance than expected, Allied engineers successfully launched one of the largest amphibious assaults of the Western Front. Thousands of troops surged across the Rhine in boats and on floating bridges, catching the Germans off guard. By the time the truth about the Bad Kreuznach deception became apparent, the damage was done. The Allied foothold across the river had been established. The German defense line was broken. And once again, the Ghost Army had helped shape the battlefield, without ever firing a shot. This was one of their last major deceptions of the war, and one of the most effective. But even as the Reich collapsed, the Ghost Army's work wasn't done. There was still one more mission waiting. One final illusion. One last performance. The Rhine had been crossed. The Allies were now pouring into Western Germany, and the end of the war in Europe was drawing near. But even in the crumbling shadow of the Third Reich, danger lurked behind every town, and pockets of resistance remained fierce. As German forces withdrew deeper into the heartland, they left behind a shattered infrastructure and ambush-ready strongholds. Allied commanders knew that mistakes at this stage, rash advances, exposed flanks, could still cost thousands of lives. And once again, the Ghost Army was called upon. Their mission: to stage one final illusion to protect a real Allied division preparing for an assault on the German town of Dessau, near the Elbe River. The real Ninth Army was planning a significant move, but the terrain left their flank dangerously exposed. If the Germans realized how thin the line was, they could launch a devastating counterattack. So, in April 1945, the Ghost Army rolled in for what would become their last battlefield deception of World War II. The plan was to simulate the presence of the 2nd Armored Division, one of the most feared American units in Europe. With their now refined combination of inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, sound effects, and theatrics, the Ghost Army set the stage for their final performance. Near the edge of Dessau, they quickly established what looked like a large armored staging ground. Sherman tank inflatables were positioned with precise spacing, covered in camouflage netting just enough to look convincingly cautious. Dummy artillery guns pointed toward the horizon. Jeeps and trucks, many of them no more than painted fabric over wooden frames, were parked along dirt roads to kick up believable dust trails. As always, sound was key. Engineers blasted recordings of rumbling tank engines, track noise, shouted commands, and heavy equipment movement, creating the unmistakable roar of an armored unit preparing for battle. Day and night, the audio filled the air, enough to be heard by enemy scouts hiding in forests or basements. In nearby towns, actors, Ghost Army soldiers in correct insignia, spread rumors of the 2nd Armored Division's presence. They casually left maps behind in bars. They dropped coded hints in front of presumed informants. They passed through villages just long enough to be seen, but not long enough to raise suspicion. Meanwhile, the real 2nd Armored Division was quietly maneuvering elsewhere, shielded by the illusion. German intelligence picked up the noise, the signals, the sightings, and adjusted their troop deployments accordingly. Reinforcements were rushed to the sector facing the fake division, stretching enemy defenses thinner in the areas where the real attacks would soon follow. For the Ghost Army, it was a fitting final act. Over the course of the war, they had pulled off more than 20 major deceptions, impersonated nearly 24 divisions, and conducted operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. But perhaps most remarkable of all, they had done it without ever engaging in direct combat. Their success wasn't measured in enemy dead, but in lives saved. Every battle avoided, every ambush sidestepped, every flank protected. These were the quiet victories of the Ghost Army. After Dessau, the end came quickly. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. World War II in Europe was over. And just like that, the Ghost Army disappeared. No parade. No medals. No mention. Their missions had been so secret, even the soldiers who served alongside them never knew they were there. It would take decades before their story began to surface, and even longer before the world recognized what they had done. When the guns fell silent in May 1945 and celebrations erupted across Europe and the United States, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, simply packed up and faded away. There was no fanfare, no grand ceremony, no public recognition. They returned home to a world that had never heard their name. For decades, their mission remained classified. The operations they had carried out, impersonating entire divisions, fooling German commanders, shaping the course of battles, were buried under top-secret seals. Not even their own families knew what they had done. Many of them quietly resumed normal lives. Some went back to art schools. Others became architects, designers, engineers, even advertising executives. A few went on to become prominent artists. One soldier, Bill Blass, would go on to build a world-famous fashion brand. Another, Ellsworth Kelly, became a celebrated minimalist painter. But whatever careers they pursued, none of them spoke publicly about the war, not because they were ashamed, but because they were ordered to stay silent. They carried their secrets like invisible medals, awarded not by generals, but by the lives they had saved. It wasn't until 1996, over 50 years after the end of the war, that the story of the Ghost Army began to surface. A handful of veterans, historians, and filmmakers started piecing together the truth through declassified documents, interviews, and long-forgotten sketches hidden in closets and attics. As the story emerged, it stunned even seasoned military experts. Here was a unit of 1,100 men who had used rubber, radio waves, paint, and sound to impersonate over 30,000 soldiers. They had operated within a few miles of enemy forces, unarmed, with nothing more than their wits and a few pistols for defense. They had conducted more than 20 full-scale deceptions across Europe, and in doing so, they had saved thousands of lives. Some historians now estimate that the Ghost Army's efforts shortened the war by weeks, maybe even months, by protecting key flanks, slowing German responses, and creating openings for Allied forces to advance with reduced resistance. And yet, their names were nowhere to be found in history books. For years, their work had been folded into the larger successes of D-Day, Patton's campaigns, and the liberation of Europe. The Ghost Army was never meant to be known, not during the war, and not afterward. In the eyes of military command, their victory was best preserved through silence. But for the men who had served in the shadows, recognition wasn't about glory. It was about remembrance. Slowly, that began to change. Veterans began speaking at schools, museums, and historical societies. Documentaries were produced. Books were written. Their sketches, photographs, and letters, once locked away in storage, were shared with the public. In 2013, the U.S. Army finally honored the unit with a Presidential Unit Citation. And in 2022, the U.S. Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors. For surviving members, now in their late 90s, the moment was emotional. Not for the recognition itself, but for what it represented, that their story would be remembered. Because the Ghost Army didn't just fight a different kind of battle, they fought an invisible one, where their courage came not from bullets or bayonets, but from the audacity to believe that illusion, when wielded with skill and purpose, could change the course of history. Their story had nearly been lost. But ghosts, it turns out, don't disappear forever. The war was over. The medals were finally given. The secrets were revealed. But the legacy of the Ghost Army didn't end when their uniforms came off. It endured, quietly, in the way wars are fought to this very day. What the Ghost Army proved in World War II was revolutionary. Deception could be as powerful as firepower. Illusion could move armies. Misdirection could save lives. And a handful of artists, engineers, and radio men could shape entire battlefields without ever pulling a trigger. Their legacy echoed into the Cold War. Intelligence agencies and military planners studied their methods, some in silence, some in admiration. Psychological operations, or PSYOPs, became standard parts of military doctrine. The idea that the perception of power could be more decisive than power itself? That had Ghost Army fingerprints all over it. Inflatable decoys were used again in Korea, in Vietnam, even in the Gulf War. The visual and sonic techniques they pioneered have been adapted with satellite tech, cyber tools, and drone-based misinformation. In a world where cameras and sensors capture every movement, deception remains a weapon, and the Ghost Army wrote its manual. But beyond the tactics, their story is a reminder of something deeper. That war is not only won by brute strength, but by creativity. By imagination. By the ability to think like the enemy, and to tell a story the enemy believes. The Ghost Army was made up of painters, set designers, radio technicians, and sound engineers, people who in another life would have been putting on plays or hanging gallery work. Instead, they donned fatigues and became storytellers of war, using rubber, smoke, and silence to shield lives and guide victory. Their story forces us to expand our definition of heroism. Because heroism doesn't always march on the front line. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly at night, sets up an inflatable tank, and vanishes before the dawn. Sometimes it's a whisper in a cafe, a phantom on the radio, a footprint in the mud that leads nowhere, because the army it belongs to doesn't exist. The Ghost Army reminds us that courage takes many forms. Not all of them loud. Not all of them armed. But all of them necessary. And now that their mission has finally been declassified, it belongs to all of us, not just as history, but as inspiration. For artists who wonder if their craft has power in a world of conflict. For soldiers who fight battles beyond the battlefield. For anyone who's ever believed that truth and illusion can be tools of justice. The Ghost Army didn't just fool Hitler. They rewrote what was possible. And their story, hidden for decades, now lives on, not in shadows, but in light. The Ghost Army fooled Hitler, with rubber tanks, fake radios, and pure imagination. What part of their story shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more hidden stories from history. Thanks for watching.